What if the life you're living right now isn't the destination? What if every breath, every choice, every moment of joy or regret is simply part of a waiting process you were never meant to remember? Imagine waking up one day, not here, but somewhere else entirely, and realizing that Earth was never your home, just a place you passed through, a waiting room. And the most unsettling part? Somewhere deep inside you, you've always suspected it. Before we go any deeper, take a second to like the video and subscribe, because what you're about to hear might change the way you see your entire life. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, or what you do every day, because by the end of this video, even the most ordinary routines might start to feel strangely unfamiliar.
There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when everything stops making sense. It doesn't happen during chaos, not during heartbreak or crisis. It comes in the stillness, when you're staring out of a window, or lying awake at night, or walking through a crowd that somehow feels distant, like you're observing it instead of living in it. And in that moment, a question rises, not loudly, but persistently. Is this really it? Not in a hopeless way, not in despair, but in curiosity, in confusion, in something deeper than either. Because for reasons you can't quite explain, life feels incomplete. Not broken, not wrong, just unfinished. This feeling has followed humanity for as long as we've been able to think. Long before cities, before empires, before written history, there was already a quiet awareness inside the human mind that something about existence didn't fully add up. Early humans looked up at the sky, not just in wonder, but in recognition, as if they weren't seeing something new, but remembering something old. Why would that instinct exist? Why would we feel drawn towards something we've never known, or something we've forgotten? As civilizations grew, this strange undercurrent didn't disappear. It evolved. It hid itself in stories, in beliefs, in rituals. Some called it the search for meaning. Others called it the soul. But underneath those names was the same sensation, the feeling that this world is not the final place, that life, as we experience it, is only a part of something much larger. You can see it in the way people live. We chase goals, we build careers, we create identities, we fill our days with purpose and structure. And yet, even when everything seems complete on the outside, something inside remains unsettled. A quiet voice that doesn't go away. It doesn't demand answers. It doesn't scream for attention. It just waits. And the unsettling part is, it feels like it's waiting with you. Think about the moments when life slows down, when there's nothing left to distract you. No screens, no conversations, no noise. Just you, alone with your thoughts. What happens then? For many people, there's a subtle discomfort. Not fear exactly, but a sense of being suspended, like time has paused, but not in a peaceful way, in a way that feels temporary. Like you're between something, waiting for something. But what? This question doesn't come from logic. It doesn't come from education or culture. Even children, before they fully understand the world, sometimes ask questions that feel strangely out of place. Where was I before I was born? Why am I here? Not what am I supposed to do, but why am I here at all? And what's even more strange, those questions don't really go away. They just get buried, replaced by responsibilities, routines, expectations. Life becomes something you manage instead of something you question. And slowly, the deeper curiosity fades into the background. But it never disappears. It waits. There's a reason why certain moments hit us harder than others. Watching a sunset, standing at the edge of the ocean, looking up at a sky filled with stars. These moments don't just feel beautiful. They feel familiar, as if they're reminding you of something you can't quite reach. Why would beauty feel like memory? Why would the vastness of the universe feel more natural than the life we're living inside it? It's a contradiction that has no easy explanation. Unless the feeling itself is the clue. What if that quiet sense of incompleteness isn't a flaw?
What if it's not anxiety, or curiosity, or imagination? What if it's awareness? A subtle recognition that this place, this life, is not where things begin or end, but where they pause. A waiting room doesn't feel permanent. It's not designed to. It's designed to hold you, to occupy your time, to keep you between one place and another. And if Earth were something like that, you wouldn't necessarily know it, but you might feel it. In the silence, in the stillness, in the moments when everything slows down and the distractions fade away. That quiet awareness would rise, just enough to be noticed, not enough to be proven, just enough to be felt. And maybe that's why it never leaves, because it's not trying to explain something, it's trying to remind you. The question is, what is it reminding you of? And why does it feel like you were never supposed to forget? Because if this is a waiting room, then somewhere beyond it, something is waiting too. Long before modern science tried to define reality, humanity was already telling stories about it. Not simple stories, not entertainment, but explanations, carefully constructed narratives meant to answer a question that refused to disappear. Why are we here? And what's strange isn't that different civilizations asked this question. It's that so many of them answered it in eerily similar ways. Thousands of years ago, in places that had no contact with each other, no shared language, no shared borders, no shared knowledge, people began describing life not as a permanent state, but as a passage, a transition, a place you move through. In ancient Egypt, existence was never confined to the physical world. Life on Earth was seen as only one phase in a much longer journey. The body was temporary, but something deeper, the essence, the consciousness, continued on. But here's what's unsettling: the way they prepared for what came after. The structures they built weren't just tombs, they were designed as gateways. Detailed instructions were written, rituals performed, objects carefully placed, all to guide the soul through what came next. Why would an entire civilization invest so much into preparing for something they couldn't see? Unless, to them, it wasn't invisible at all. Across the world in ancient India, early philosophical traditions spoke of life as a cycle, birth, death, and rebirth. But this cycle wasn't seen as a gift, it was seen as something to escape. The idea wasn't to stay here, it was to move beyond, to break free from the repetition, the illusion, the constant returning. Existence itself was described as a kind of veil, a temporary state that concealed a deeper reality, a reality that felt more true than this one. And then, in ancient Greece, philosophers began questioning the nature of reality itself. One of the most famous ideas described humanity as prisoners in a cave, watching shadows on a wall and believing those shadows to be real. The true world, they argued, existed outside, unseen, unknown, but infinitely more real than the one we experience. Think about that. Not just a different place, a more real place, which means this one might not be. How could civilizations so distant from each other arrive at ideas so similar? Different cultures, different languages, different environments, and yet the same underlying message keeps appearing. This is not the final state. This is not where everything begins. This is not where everything ends. It's something in between, a passage, a transition, a waiting point. Even in ancient Mesoamerican cultures, there were beliefs that life was a journey across multiple layers of existence. The physical world was only one level among many, each with its own rules, its own purpose. And moving between them wasn't unusual, it was expected. So why does modern thinking treat life as a singular, isolated experience? Why do we assume that what we see is all there is, when so many before us believed the opposite? It's easy to dismiss ancient ideas as mythology, as imagination, as early attempts to explain a confusing world. But there's something about these patterns that doesn't feel random, because myths usually vary wildly. They reflect culture, environment, creativity. But these ideas, they align, they converge, they repeat the same theme over and over again. Life is not the destination. It's a stage, a phase, a place you pass through on the way to something else. And maybe the most unsettling part isn't that ancient civilizations believed this. It's that they seemed certain, not curious, not speculative, certain, as if they weren't just guessing, as if they were remembering. What if these beliefs weren't created out of imagination? What if they were fragments of something older, something that existed before recorded history, before language, before civilization itself? A kind of inherited understanding that slowly faded over time, leaving behind only symbols, stories, and rituals, like echoes of a truth that became harder to hear. Because over time, something changed. As societies advanced, as science developed, as logic began to dominate the way we understand the world, those ancient ideas started to disappear. Not because they were disproven, but because they were forgotten, replaced by explanations that focused only on what could be measured, observed, tested. The unseen became irrelevant.
The unknown became unnecessary, and the idea that life might be something more than a single linear experience was pushed aside. But even now, traces of it remain, in language, in instinct, in the way people still talk about finding their purpose as if it already exists somewhere beyond them, in the way death is often described not as an end, but as a passing, a transition, a movement from one state to another. Why do we use those words? Why does that perspective still exist, even in a world driven by certainty and proof? Because somewhere beneath everything we've learned, something older is still there, something quieter, something harder to explain, but impossible to fully erase. And maybe those ancient civilizations weren't trying to predict the future. Maybe they were trying to preserve a memory, a warning, or even a reminder that this place, this world we've built, this life we've accepted as permanent, was never meant to be. Because if Earth truly is a waiting room, then those who came before us may have known something we've forgotten, and the stories they left behind might not be myths at all. They might be instructions or clues left for anyone willing to question what reality really is. Because the deeper you look into the past, the harder it becomes to ignore one unsettling possibility. Humanity didn't just wonder about what comes next. It once understood that something does. And whatever that something is, it may be closer than we think. There is something strange about time. Not the way we measure it, but the way we feel it. An hour can vanish without warning, or stretch into something unbearable. A single moment can feel eternal, while entire years slip past like they never happened at all. And no matter how precisely we divide it, seconds, minutes, days, it never quite behaves the way we expect. It doesn't move like a straight line. It pretends to. But if you pay attention, something about it begins to feel unstable. Think about your earliest memory. Not something you were told, something you actually remember. There's a point where your awareness seems to begin. Before that, nothing. No thoughts, no identity, no sense of being. Just absence. And yet, you existed. Your body was there. Your life had already started. But you, the observer, the experiencer, weren't fully present. Or at least, you can't access it. Why? Why does consciousness appear as if it's switched on at a certain moment, instead of unfolding continuously? And why can't we remember anything before it? It's as if there's a boundary, a line you can't cross. Not physically, but mentally. As if time, in your experience, has a starting point that doesn't match reality. And that raises an unsettling possibility. What if time isn't something you move through? What if it's something you're placed into? From the outside, time looks structured, predictable, measurable. But from the inside, it feels fragmented, selective, almost edited. Entire portions of your life are missing, not because they didn't happen, but because you can't recall them. Days blur together, years compress into vague impressions. The past becomes less of a timeline and more of a collection of scattered moments. Why would a continuous reality produce such discontinuous memory? Unless continuity isn't the point.
unless the experience of time is designed not to reflect reality accurately, but to simulate it just enough. Consider how often people describe certain moments as feeling out of time. Moments of intense focus, deep emotion, sudden realization. In those instances, time seems to slow down or disappear entirely. Seconds stretch into something vast. Awareness sharpens. The world feels more real and less constrained. Almost as if for a brief instant, you're stepping outside the normal flow. But if time were truly constant, that wouldn't happen. It wouldn't bend. It wouldn't warp. It wouldn't respond to perception. Unless time isn't fixed at all.
It's something your mind participates in creating. And if that's the case, then what we experience isn't time itself. It's an interpretation, a constructed version of something far more complex. Now imagine this. If you were placed into a waiting room, somewhere designed to hold you temporarily, you wouldn't want to feel like you were waiting forever. You'd need something to occupy your awareness, something to structure your experience, something that gives the illusion of movement without actually taking you anywhere. Time does exactly that. It gives the sense of progression, of change, of direction. But does it actually lead anywhere? Or does it simply pass? Think about how life unfolds. You move from one stage to another. Childhood, adolescence, adulthood. Each phase feels significant while you're in it. Each one seems like it matters deeply. But once it's over, it becomes distant, almost unreal, like something you dreamed rather than lived. And no matter how much you move forward, there's always another stage waiting, another phase, another version of your life that feels just as temporary as the last. There's no final point where everything resolves, no moment where time stops and says, "You've arrived." It just continues, endlessly, until it doesn't. And that's where things become even more difficult to understand, because no one experiences the end of time. We only experience the end of our place within it. From your perspective, time begins when you become aware and ends when that awareness fades. But outside of that, time continues, or at least it appears to. So what is time really? A universal constant or a personal experience? A fundamental part of reality or a system layered on top of it? Because if Earth is a waiting room, then time might not be a natural force at all. It might be a feature, something that creates the illusion of a journey while you remain exactly where you are, something that prevents you from noticing that you're not progressing toward a destination, but simply existing within a controlled flow, a kind of holding pattern. And if that's true, then the most important question isn't how much time you have, it's whether time itself is real in the way you believe it is. Because if it isn't, then everything built on top of it, your past, your future, your sense of movement, becomes uncertain. And that uncertainty leads to a realization that's hard to ignore. If time is not what it seems, then neither is the idea of waiting. Because waiting only makes sense if there's something ahead, something you're moving toward. But what if you're not moving at all? What if the feeling of waiting doesn't come from time passing, but from something inside you recognizing that this entire experience, this structured, flowing, time-bound existence, isn't the destination, it's the delay. And somewhere beyond it, something else exists. Not in the future, not at the end of time, but outside of it, waiting for you to arrive. Or maybe, waiting for you to remember how to leave. There's a moment in life, quiet, almost unnoticeable, when you begin to feel like you didn't exactly choose any of this. Not your name, not your birthplace, not your language, not the family you were born into, or the circumstances that shaped you before you even understood what shaping meant. You simply arrived, and everything was already in place. Your life didn't begin as a blank canvas. It began as a script already in motion. Think about that for a second. Before you spoke your first word, before you formed your first memory, your environment had already started defining you. The sounds around you became your language. The behaviors you observed became your normal. The expectations placed on you began to quietly build the boundaries of who you would become. At no point did you step back and decide any of it. It just happened. And as you grew older, the illusion of choice slowly took over. You chose your interests, your friends, your goals, but even those choices were influenced by everything that came before, your upbringing, your surroundings, your experiences. So how much of your life is truly chosen, and how much of it is assigned? This question isn't meant to take away your sense of control.
It's meant to shift your perspective, because if you look closely, life starts to feel less like something you're freely creating and more like something you're navigating, a structure, a path, a system already built where you simply move from one stage to another. School, work, responsibility, routine. Each phase comes with expectations, roles you're meant to play, milestones you're supposed to reach. And while you can deviate slightly, take a different job, live in a different place, meet different people, the overall pattern remains strangely consistent, as if the framework itself doesn't change, only the details inside it. Why does life follow such a structured path? Why do billions of people, across different cultures and time periods, move through similar stages with such consistency? It's not just biology. It's not just society. There's something deeper at play, a sense that the structure of life exists independently of the individuals living it, as if the roles were already there, and we step into them. You don't invent the idea of career. You inherit it. You don't create the concept of success. You learn it. You don't define the meaning of progress. You adopt it. And once you're inside that system, it becomes incredibly difficult to step outside of it, not because you're physically trapped, but because everything around you reinforces it. Every conversation, every expectation, every measure of value, it all points in the same direction. Move forward, achieve more, become something. But what if that direction isn't leading you anywhere new? What if it's simply keeping you in motion, so you don't stop and question where you are? Because stopping is where things begin to feel different. When you pause, truly pause, without distraction or obligation, the structure starts to loosen, the roles feel less solid, the identity you've built begins to blur at the edges, and for a brief moment, you're not your job, not your name, not your responsibilities. You're just aware, present. And in that state, something unusual happens. The sense of assignment becomes clearer. You begin to feel like you're inside something, rather than entirely part of it, like an actor who suddenly becomes aware of the stage. And once that awareness appears, it's hard to ignore, because it changes the way you see everything. The routines that once felt necessary begin to feel repetitive. The goals that once felt urgent begin to feel optional. Even the idea of identity starts to shift. Who are you really, without the roles you've been given, without the expectations you've inherited, without the path you've been following? It's not an easy question to answer, because most of what we call self is built from those very things. But if your life were entirely self-created, would it look exactly like it does now? Or would it be something completely different? And if the answer is different, then where did this version come from? Why this life? Why this set of circumstances? Why this particular path among billions of possibilities? It's easy to say it's random, chance, probability, but randomness doesn't usually produce such structured outcomes. It doesn't create systems that feel so consistent, so repeatable, so organized, unless what we're experiencing isn't random at all, unless it's designed, not necessarily in a traditional sense, not by something we can easily define or understand, but structured in a way that guides experience rather than leaving it to chance. A system that assigns starting points, provides frameworks, and then allows variation within those boundaries. Just enough freedom to feel real, just enough structure to keep everything in place. If Earth were a waiting room, this would make sense. You wouldn't want chaos. You wouldn't want complete unpredictability. You'd need a stable environment, a system that keeps people engaged, occupied, moving, something that gives the illusion of progression, even if the destination lies elsewhere. And the roles we play, the lives we live, could be part of that system. Not meaningless, not insignificant, but not final either. Temporary, contextual, assigned for a time and then left behind. Think about how many identities you've already had. Child, student, friend, maybe something else now. Each one felt real while you were inside it. Each one shaped your experience. But none of them lasted. They changed, evolved, or disappeared entirely. And yet something remained constant through all of it. The awareness behind those roles. The part of you that observed each phase, each identity, each version of your life. That part didn't change. It didn't age in the same way. It didn't follow the same structure. It simply experienced. What if that's the real you? Not the assigned identity, not the structured life, but the awareness moving through it, observing it, participating in it without being fully defined by it. If that's true, then this life becomes something very different. Not a fixed reality, but a temporary role, a position you occupy for a time, inside a system that feels permanent,
but isn't. And if roles can be assigned, they can also be released, which raises a question that feels both simple and unsettling. If this life is something you are placed into, then what exists beyond it? And more importantly, who are you when you're no longer playing the part?
There are moments when the structure breaks, not slowly, not subtly, but all at once. Moments when everything that feels stable, time, identity, reality itself, begins to loosen, as if the system holding it together is no longer fully in control. For most people, those moments never come. Life continues within its familiar boundaries. Days pass, routines repeat, and the deeper questions remain just beneath the surface. But for some, there is an interruption, an event, a threshold, a point where life doesn't quite end, but doesn't continue the way it should either. And in that space, something happens. For centuries, people who have come close to death have returned with stories that feel strangely consistent. Not identical, but similar enough to raise questions that are difficult to ignore. They describe a sensation of separation. Not pain, not fear, but a quiet detachment. As if the body, the physical anchor of their existence, has suddenly become distant, irrelevant. And what follows is not darkness, not nothingness, but awareness, clearer than before, sharper, more present than anything they've experienced in ordinary life. How is that possible? If consciousness is tied to the body, if the brain is what produces awareness, then how can awareness feel stronger when the body is shutting down? Why would clarity increase as the system supposedly fails? This is where the pattern begins to shift. Because many describe the same progression not as an ending, but as a transition, a movement, a passage through something. There is often a sense of traveling, not physically, but perceptually, as if they are being drawn towards something beyond their current state. Not forced, not rushed, just guided. And then there's the light. Not a blinding flash, not something external, but something that feels familiar, recognizable in a way that's hard to explain. People struggle to describe it because it doesn't behave like anything we understand. It's not just seen, it's felt, experienced, known. And the most unsettling part? It doesn't feel new. It feels like something they've encountered before, something they've forgotten. Why would the unknown feel familiar? Why would something beyond life feel more natural than life itself? Some describe encountering a presence, not a figure, not a defined being, but an awareness that feels vast, understanding, as if whatever lies beyond the boundary of life is not empty, but full. Not chaotic, but structured. And in that moment, many report a sense of knowing, not through words or thoughts, but through direct experience. A realization that what they believed to be reality was only a part of something much larger. And then, just as suddenly as it begins, it stops. They return. Back into the body. Back into the structure. Back into time. And almost immediately, the clarity fades. The intensity dissolves. The memory remains, but it feels distant, like trying to hold on to a dream that's already slipping away. Why? Why would such a profound experience become harder to grasp the moment it ends? Why wouldn't it stay clear, sharp, undeniable? Unless clarity itself doesn't belong here. Unless the state they entered is not compatible with the system they returned to. Because if Earth is a waiting room, then stepping outside of it, even briefly, would feel completely different. More real, more complete, less restricted. And coming back would feel limiting, confining. Not necessarily in a negative way, but in a way that makes you aware of the boundaries you didn't notice before. Many who have had these experiences describe a shift afterward. Not always dramatic, not always immediate, but noticeable. Their priorities change. Their perception of life becomes less rigid. The things that once felt urgent begin to lose their weight.
And the question of what happens next becomes less abstract and more personal. Because for a brief moment, they were there. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to feel the difference. Enough to sense that what lies beyond this life is not an absence, but a continuation, a transition into something that feels more complete than this. But here's where the question becomes difficult to ignore. If these experiences are simply the result of a dying brain, why do they follow such consistent patterns? Why do people from different cultures, different backgrounds, different belief systems describe similar sensations? Separation, movement, light, presence, return. It's not proof, but it's not random either. It's a pattern, and patterns usually point to something underlying, something real enough to repeat, even if we don't fully understand it. What if these moments aren't hallucinations? What if they're glimpses? Brief exposures to something that exists beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience. Not the end, but the edge, the doorway. Because a waiting room only makes sense if there's somewhere else to go. A place you eventually enter. A transition you eventually make. And if that's true, then near-death experiences might not be anomalies. They might be previews, unintended openings, moments where the system weakens just enough to let something else through, or to let you through, just enough to remember. And if people can reach that threshold, if they can step close to whatever lies beyond, then the idea that life is a closed system begins to break down, because it suggests that this isn't all there is, that the boundary is not solid, that the waiting room has doors. And sometimes, those doors open. Not fully, not permanently, but enough to reveal something that changes everything. Because once you've seen, even for a moment, that there is something beyond this, it becomes impossible to believe that this was ever meant to be the final place. Which leads to a question that feels both unsettling and inevitable. If there is a doorway, then what decides when you walk through it? And what happens when you don't come back?
There's something missing. Not in the obvious sense, not something you can point to or clearly define, but something subtle, something that reveals itself only when you begin to question the edges of your own awareness. A gap. Not just in memory, but in continuity. You know who you are. You know your name, your past, your experiences. You can trace your life back through years, through events, through moments that shaped you. But eventually, that trail ends. Not gradually, abruptly. There's a point where memory stops, not because nothing existed before it, but because you can't access it. Before your earliest memory, there is nothing. No thoughts, no awareness, no sense of self. And yet, you were here, alive, present in the world, but not present in your own experience. Why? Why does consciousness appear to begin midstream, as if it were switched on after the story had already started? And more importantly, where were you before that point? It's easy to dismiss this as a limitation of the brain, a developmental stage, a natural process. But that explanation only addresses how memory forms, not why it feels incomplete. Because it's not just early childhood that's missing. Large portions of your life, days, weeks, even years, fade into fragments. You remember highlights, emotional peaks, defining moments. But the majority of your existence is gone. Not erased, just inaccessible, as if it was never meant to be fully retained. Imagine watching a film where only certain scenes are visible, while the rest are blurred or cut entirely. You can still follow the story, but it feels disjointed, incomplete, like you're only seeing what you're allowed to see. What if memory works the same way? Not as a perfect record of everything that happens, but as a filtered version of experience. A curated sequence of moments that creates the illusion of continuity without actually preserving it. And if that's true, then what determines what gets remembered? Why do some moments stay vivid while others disappear completely? Why does your mind hold on to certain details with precision while entire stretches of time dissolve into nothing? It doesn't feel random. It feels selective, intentional almost, as if memory isn't just about storage, but about limitation. Because without those gaps, without that forgetting, something strange would happen. You would remember everything, every second, every detail, every version of yourself across time. And that kind of awareness wouldn't feel like clarity. It would feel overwhelming, unmanageable, almost impossible to navigate. So maybe forgetting isn't a flaw. Maybe it's necessary, a way to keep the experience contained, focused, linear. But what if it serves another purpose? What if forgetting doesn't just simplify your current life, but separates you from something else entirely?
Because the most significant gap isn't within your life, it's before it. You don't remember arriving here. You don't remember choosing this existence. You don't remember anything before your awareness began. It's as if your entire sense of self must be different. Why would you, the observer, the experiencer, just begin without any connection to what came before? Unless the connection exists, but is hidden, not erased, not destroyed, just inaccessible. And if that's the case, then the question changes. It's no longer, do we have a past before this life? It becomes, why can't we remember it? What if memory isn't just a natural process, but a controlled one? What if forgetting isn't simply the result of biological limitation, but part of the structure itself? Because if Earth is a waiting room, then remembering where you came from would change everything. You wouldn't settle into the experience. You wouldn't fully engage with the roles, the routines, the identity you've been given. You would constantly compare it to something else, something more familiar, something more real, and that comparison would break the illusion. So instead, you forget. Not completely, not perfectly, just enough to make this feel like the only place that exists, but not enough to erase the feeling that something is missing. Because that feeling still lingers, in subtle ways, in moments of déjà vu, when something feels familiar even though you know it shouldn't, in dreams that don't feel like imagination, but like fragments of something you can't quite place, in the strange sense that certain places, people, or experiences feel significant before you understand why. These moments don't prove anything, but they hint at something deeper, something just beyond reach, like trying to recall a memory that's right there, but refuses to fully surface. What if those moments aren't random? What if they're leaks, small breaks in the barrier that separates this life from whatever came before it? Because no system is perfect, no structure is completely sealed. And if there is something beyond this, something we've forgotten, then traces of it might still find their way through. Not clearly, not directly, but enough to create that persistent sense of familiarity, that quiet feeling that you've been here before, or somewhere like it. And if memory can be limited, it can also be restored. Maybe not all at once, maybe not in a way that's easy to understand, but gradually, in fragments, in realizations, in moments when everything feels slightly more connected, slightly more clear, as if the boundaries of your awareness are expanding. And the more you question, the more you notice those gaps, not as emptiness, but as something waiting to be filled, which leads to a possibility that's difficult to ignore. What if you haven't forgotten everything? What if the most important parts are still there, just hidden beneath the surface? And what if this life, the roles, the structure, the experience of time, isn't meant to give you new knowledge, but to keep you from accessing what you already know? Because if you were to remember completely, if the full continuity of your awareness returned, then this place would no longer feel like a destination. It would feel exactly what it is, temporary, a pause, a waiting room. And once you realize that, the question isn't just where you came from, it's whether you were ever meant to forget it in the first place, or whether forgetting was the only way to keep you here, for now.
There's a rhythm to life that feels almost impossible to escape. Not because it's forced, but because it's everywhere. From the moment you wake up, your day begins to fill itself. Tasks, responsibilities, conversations, notifications, a constant flow of activity that moves you forward without ever asking where you're going. And if you follow that rhythm long enough, something subtle begins to happen. You stop questioning it. Not because you found the answers, but because you no longer have the time to ask the questions. This is how the system works, not through control, but through occupation. Because a mind that is constantly engaged is a mind that rarely looks beyond what's in front of it. Think about how rare it is to truly do nothing. Not scrolling, not thinking about what's next, not planning, worrying, or reflecting. Just being. For most people, that state is uncomfortable, almost unnatural. Silence feels heavy. Stillness feels unfamiliar. And within seconds, the mind begins searching for something to fill the space. Why? Why does emptiness feel so difficult to tolerate? Why does the absence of distraction create a kind of pressure, as if something is missing? Because in that emptiness, something begins to surface. Not clearly, not fully, but enough to be noticed. A quiet awareness. The same feeling that appears in stillness, in silence, in those rare moments when nothing is pulling your attention outward. The feeling that something about this experience is incomplete. And the system is built to prevent that feeling from growing. Not intentionally, perhaps, but effectively. From early on, your time is structured. School teaches you how to think, how to behave, how to move through predefined stages. It gives you knowledge, but it also gives you direction, a path, one that leads seamlessly into the next phase. Work, responsibility, routine. Each stage builds on the last, filling your time with purpose, goals, and expectations. And while those things are necessary, while they give life structure and meaning, they also serve another function. They keep you engaged, focused, occupied. Because when your attention is fully absorbed in the present system, you rarely step outside of it. You don't question the structure. You move within it. And the more you move, the less you notice the boundaries. This isn't about manipulation. It's about design. A system doesn't need to control every action. It only needs to guide enough of them to keep everything stable, predictable, consistent. And that's exactly what modern life provides. A continuous stream of activity that leaves very little space for deep reflection. Even in moments of rest, the mind remains engaged. Entertainment replaces silence. Information replaces stillness. There is always something to watch, something to read, something to think about, something to keep the flow going. And the result is subtle but powerful. You remain inside the experience, fully immersed, without ever stepping back far enough to see it for what it might be. Because stepping back requires distance, and distance requires stillness. And stillness is the one thing the system quietly avoids. But every once in a while, something disrupts the rhythm. A moment where everything slows down, not because you chose it, but because it happens.
A long night where sleep won't come. A quiet afternoon where nothing feels urgent. A sudden pause in the constant movement of life. And in that pause, the awareness returns. The questions resurface. The feeling that something isn't quite complete becomes impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, the system feels transparent, like you can see through it. Not entirely, but enough to notice that it exists. That your life, your routines, your goals, your identity, are all part of something structured, something that keeps you moving but never quite lets you stop. And once you notice that, it becomes harder to unsee, because you begin to recognize the patterns, the way time is filled, the way attention is directed, the way life flows from one task to another, one goal to the next, without ever reaching a point of completion. There's always more to do, more to achieve, more to become, but never a final moment where everything settles, where the movement ends, where the waiting stops. And that's the key, because if this were the destination, there would be an end point, a sense of arrival, a moment where everything resolves into clarity. But that moment never comes. It's always just ahead, just out of reach. Which means the system isn't designed to bring you there. It's designed to keep you moving toward it, endlessly. Because movement creates the illusion of progress, and progress creates the illusion of purpose. And purpose keeps you engaged without needing to question the foundation beneath it. But what if the foundation itself is the question? What if the reason life feels like a constant cycle of effort, achievement, repetition is not because that's all there is, but because that's what keeps you inside it? Because a waiting room doesn't need to trap you physically. It only needs to hold your attention, to give you enough to do that you don't notice you're waiting. And if that's true, then the structure of life, the routines, the goals, the endless movement, might not be random at all. They might be the very thing that keeps the experience stable, convincing, real. But once you begin to see that, once you start to recognize how your time is filled, how your attention is guided, how your life moves within a predefined flow, something shifts. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly. You start to notice the gaps, the spaces between the movement,
the moments where the system loosens just enough for something else to appear. A deeper awareness, a quieter understanding that this constant motion might not be leading you somewhere. It might be keeping you somewhere. And if that's the case, then the most important question isn't what you're moving toward. It's what happens when you stop. Because in that stillness, beyond the distractions, beyond the structure, beyond the constant flow of activity, you might begin to sense something that has been there all along, waiting, not in front of you, not in the future, but beyond the system itself. And if you can feel that, even for a moment, then the possibility becomes impossible to ignore. That this entire experience, this structured, busy, endlessly moving life, was never meant to be the final place. It was meant to keep you here, until something changes, or until you do. And when that happens, the system might not be able to hold you in the same way anymore. Which leaves one final question, hanging just beneath the surface. If this place is designed to keep you occupied, then what happens when you no longer need it to?
It's a moment, quiet, inevitable, when everything you've known begins to loosen its grip. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gently, almost imperceptibly. The structure that once felt solid starts to feel lighter. The urgency that once drove your every decision begins to fade. The roles, the expectations, the constant movement, they don't disappear, but they stop defining you in the same way. And in that shift, something becomes clear. You were never meant to stay here forever. Because no matter how deeply you engage with life, no matter how much you build, achieve, or experience, there is always an ending. Not as a failure, not as a loss, but as a transition. And somewhere deep inside, you've always known that. Not as a fear, but as a quiet certainty that this, eventually, comes to a close. But what happens in that moment? Not in theory, not in belief, but in experience. When the structure dissolves, when the sense of identity begins to fall away, when the boundaries that once defined you start to blur, what remains? For most of life, identity feels fixed. You are your name, your history, your relationships, your memories. But all of those things are tied to this place, to this system. And if this system is temporary, then those identities are temporary too. So when the moment of leaving arrives, they don't go with you, not in the way you understand them now. And that realization can feel unsettling, because it means that everything you've built your sense of self around is not permanent. But at the same time, it reveals something deeper. Because if identity can fall away, but awareness remains, then what you truly are was never defined by those things to begin with. You are not the role, you are not the structure, you are not the timeline you've been moving through. You are the awareness that experienced it. And awareness doesn't end in the same way. It shifts, it moves, it continues, but not within the same boundaries. Because the moment of leaving isn't like moving from one place to another within this world. It's not a continuation of the same experience. It's a change in the nature of experience itself. Time no longer behaves the same way. Identity no longer feels fixed. The sense of separation between you and everything else begins to dissolve, not into nothingness, but into something that feels more complete, more connected, as if the limitations that once defined your experience were never part of you, only part of where you were. And once those limitations fall away, the waiting ends. But here's where the question becomes impossible to ignore. If the waiting ends, then what begins? Because a waiting room only exists for one purpose, to prepare you for what comes next, not to hold you forever, not to define your existence, but to bridge one state to another. So what is this place preparing you for? Is it simply a transition into something unknown? Or is it something more specific, more intentional? Because if you look back at everything, the feeling of incompleteness, the echoes from ancient civilizations, the strange nature of time, the sense that life is structured,
the glimpses beyond through near-death experiences, the gaps in memory, the system that keeps you occupied, they all point in the same direction, not outward, but beyond.
Beyond the structure, beyond the illusion, beyond the idea that this is all there is. And when you reach the moment of leaving, that direction becomes clear. Not as a thought, but as an experience, a recognition. As if something that was hidden suddenly becomes obvious. Not new, not unfamiliar, but remembered. And in that moment, the question of where am I going fades, because it's replaced by something else entirely. I know this. A sense of return. Not to a place you can describe, but to a state that feels more natural than anything you've ever known. As if everything you experienced here was real, but incomplete. A fragment, a portion of something much larger. And now, that larger reality begins to unfold. But not everyone experiences this in the same way. Not every transition feels identical. Because just as life within this system varies, so might the way we move beyond it. And that uncertainty leaves room for something important. Choice. Not in the way we usually think about it, but in a deeper sense. Because if awareness continues, if identity is not fixed, if the structure of this world is not the final layer, then the moment of leaving might not be a single path. It might be a point of divergence. A moment where something within you, something beyond memory, beyond identity, guides what happens next. And if that's true, then this life isn't just a waiting period. It's preparation. Not for a destination, but for a decision. One that you may not consciously remember making, but one that shapes everything that follows. Which brings us back to the beginning. The feeling. That quiet sense that something about this place isn't final. That life feels like a pause rather than a conclusion. That deep, unexplainable awareness that you are part of something larger than what you can see. What if that feeling isn't random? What if it's not imagination? What if it's the only part of you that remembers the truth? Because if Earth is a waiting room, then everything you've experienced, every moment, every thought, every question, has been part of that waiting. Not meaningless, not wasted, but incomplete. And incompleteness implies continuation. Something beyond. Something more. The question is no longer whether this is the end. It's whether you're ready to see it for what it is. A pause. A passage. A place between what was and what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, the moment of leaving isn't something to fear. It's something you've been moving toward all along. Not through time, not through effort, but through awareness. Because the door was never hidden. It was simply waiting for you to realize that you were already standing in front of it.